This is my class project on a question from history, and my question is, what caused slavery to end in England in 1833, and what were some of the things that led to that political decision to end slavery? Just to refresh a little bit, some of these is just a little recap of what was going on in the early 1700s with the slave trade that took millions of Africans from their homeland in Africa and took them across the Atlantic in what is known as the Middle Passage. And this is just a photo I've pulled from Duke's website that shows where some of the numbers went. But let's just start with how slavery ended in England. We have to actually back up a little bit further and look into what led to the abolition of the slave trade. So what made it illegal for Africans to be taken from Africa and sold as cargo? One of the biggest things that I found was some people didn't believe that Africans objected to it and that their living conditions would be better as slaves. And some religious members of the English government and Parliament made the point that it would be better for them to be slaves under Christians than as savages in Africa. But one of the bigger things that led to the changing of that mindset was somebody named Olaudah Equiano, if I pronounce that correctly. But he was someone who was a prince in Africa and then was sold into slavery. He ended up working through slavery, and I believe he bought his way out of slavery. And then he wrote a book about his experiences. And the campaigners published that book widely, and it sold out publications multiple times. But a quotation from his book was, "Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice?" But that's just one of the few quotes from his book, which tells the story of his life, but then also called people to end slavery and the slave trade. One of the biggest things that led to it was actually campaigns. So there were multiple religious campaigns and political campaigns, as well as just the young people starting to do movements and things. And one of the things that circulated widely was an image like this of the conditions inside of a slave ship, which at the time people didn't know what the conditions were, because there was no media, there was no way to know unless you actually were on the ship. And so there were researchers and a lot of political campaigns. One of the biggest pieces of some of the initial campaigns was actually this image. Before, the 1700s, there wasn't a lot of political campaigning in a sense, because governments didn't run like that. And so with Parliament being established and people being able to petition and to vote, then we get, I think, one of the first representation of actually proper campaigning was an image of "Am I not a man and a brother?" of an African kneeling asking to be let out of slavery. And that's just a politically charged image. So there was a number of religious campaigns throughout that time for the moral side of it, and then there was a lot of political campaigns led by William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and some others who wanted to see slavery end, and they traveled the country, they did petitions, they did everything you could imagine campaigning was. Now they did it. And then one of the biggest things I found, so in 1807, the slave trade was finally abolished, but slavery was still legal in the English Empire. And one of the biggest things that I found that led to the actual abolishment of it was something called the Reform Act. Now, the Reform Act if this opens up, here we go, was in 1832. So before 1832, there were some seats in the House of Commons were controlled by boroughs, which is like little towns that had been established 200 years prior, and nobody lived there anymore except for like 7 people. And so the richest person would control the votes of those 7 people. And ballots weren't secret, so whoever was turning the ballot could see everyone's votes. And so, especially, there was many places like this where there would be a rich landowner who would control all of the votes in a certain town, and so they would control those seats in Parliament. These were called rotten boroughs or pocket boroughs because all the voters were in the pocket of the richest person. But the election in 1832, what happened was they restructured how towns had members, and so they took towns that only had like 7 people and restructured it and basically redrew the lines to give an analogy for the American people. But what led to was 200 new seats that were opposed to slavery, because prior to that there was a lot of seats that had been bought by the rich landowners and the plantation owners that didn't want slavery to end because of their holdings in the West Indies that needed slaves to run. And so through their money, they had bought different seats in the government to oppose anybody that wanted to end slavery. And when they restructured the lines, they lost 200 seats. And so then the next year, slavery was abolished in England. And so, just a review, there were many causes to it, not just those 3, but one of the biggest one was people finally had a personal and way to understand what was actually happening through Olaudah Equiano and many other people who communicated stories. They actually made the problem real to the people in England, and some of the first real campaigning ever we see, because before the 1700s there wasn't that much campaigning. It was just the strongest person won versus the people were able to campaign. And then the Reform Act of 1832 restructured the government in a way that enabled the ending of slavery as we know it. And here's, I don't know if you saw, but there's a bunch of my sources stated at the bottom of these. I could click it, but I don't think that's a good idea because then I'll end this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and this class has been a pleasure.